Hello, welcome everyone on this crazy day of all days. Welcome to Hamlet, Friend of Arab Democracy. I especially want to thank you for being here today because, again, as I just mentioned a second ago, it's a day with a lot of unexpected developments that are taking place in our midst, on our campus, a lot of things that are pushing us to ask why we do the things that we do under such circumstances and why it's important to continue to do them under such circumstances. So I just want to thank you for being here, and I hope that some of what we discuss today its obvious connections to what's happening in our immediate world right now will become obvious as we start discussing them. So I'm delighted to be here today to welcome you to an afternoon devoted to thinking about Shakespeare, or rather about what the idea of Shakespeare has made possible in Arab political theater in the 20th century, and how the history of Arab Shakespeare might, in turn, either confirm or modify or challenge the way that the bard has figured in Turkish theater. So our task today is a multi-part one, and at its center is the work of Margaret Litvin. Professor Litvin is Associate Professor of Arabic and Comparative Literature at Boston University, where she's the founding director of the Middle East and North Africa Studies program. Professor Litvin comes to us today, however, from Berlin, where she's currently in residence as an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the Europe in the Middle East in Europe program. And in many ways, this institutional context to Europe in the Middle East in Europe, is mirrors for us the kind of thorny questions that sit at the center of her research. Where exactly is Europe in the Middle East? Or more precisely, how have European literary traditions arrived in the broad political geography that is encapsulated by the phrase Middle East? In her 2011 book, Hamlet's Arab Journey, Shakespeare's Prince and Nasser's Ghost, Litvin arrives at this question by way of a focus on the figure of Hamlet, the young Danish prince whose life is thrown into disarray upon his father's untimely and brutal death. As Litvin traces the Arab world's enduring fascination with Hamlet's afflictions, she overturns a series of assumptions about how Shakespeare enters the Arab world, about how adaptation engages with an authoritative text, and about how artists position themselves in relation to the cultural heritage they wish to portray. These are precisely the questions that we'll be thinking about today. We'll begin our journey in late 19th century Egypt, and we will slowly move forward in time to consider the latest Arab Shakespeare adaptations taking place currently actually in Berlin. We will then move on to our panel featuring Ethan Guagliardo, Inci Bilgin Tekin, and Melis Günekan'ın, who will each briefly pick up on a different analytical or historical thread of Hamlet's Arab journey. We will then move on to our Q&A, so our event will have this three-part structure. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite you to join me in welcoming Margaret Litvin to Boğaziçi. Her talk today is entitled Hamlet, Friend of Arab Democracy. Thank you, Margaret, for being with us.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Emine, I'm so grateful to be invited here, and also Ethan, Melis, and Inji, thank you so much for taking a day out of your own lives and your own work to contribute to this discussion, which I'm really excited for and hoping to learn a lot from. Let me start by putting all my theoretical cards on the table. So I am an outsider researching Arab and Arabic theater. As an outsider, my grounding assumption is that my research subjects are intelligent interlocutors. They know everything I know about how the world works, and in many cases more. They're not naive, they're not fools. Therefore, the best Arabic theater, and it's mostly political theater, so the best Arab political theater is sharply aware of its own inefficacy. These people know that there's a limit to what theater or public performance, artistic performance, even sometimes peaceful public protest can actually achieve if its goal is to bring about political change. So my research starts by asking, why Arab playwrights and directors continue to make political theater in dark times. I want to know why and precisely at which moments their projects take the seemingly bizarre form of adapting Shakespeare, why this is relevant and useful to them. And then in tracing how global examples from French and Soviet and Eastern European and Anglo-American traditions have shaped their artistic vocabularies. I'm not interested in asking about the influence. Usually the way that we study Shakespeare adaptation, it's pretty simplistic. We ask, what happened? We have two eyes, we're binocular creatures. We're used to asking about the difference between text B and text A. This is a good class exercise, it teaches well, there are good reasons to do it. If we're really super sophisticated, we might try to provide a thick description of the context and what it is about the conditions that explain the differences between text B and text A. But I want to argue for something a lot more complicated, that there is a whole host of factors, including local traditions and fashions and expressive needs, previous Shakespeare traditions, and intertext from a whole range of directions coming in. And so in asking about how these things are metabolized and appropriated and remixed, I'm not interested in tracing their influence at all. What I'm interested in is their local utility. How do they serve? What hungers has the Shakespeare tradition fed? What needs has it met? What rhetorical interventions has it enabled that would have been harder without Shakespeare's name behind them? So today's talk will not be theoretical. Instead, I'm going to try to offer a very quick flying survey of the Arab Shakespeare adaptation from three periods. From the very beginning, I'm going to start in 1901, and then the post-1967 period, when post-colonial autocracies have disappointed, when their promise has become disenchanted. And then the differently globalized period of this century, from 2001 to last Friday. So what's changed perhaps the most in this period is the adapter's relationship, not to the idea of Shakespeare, but to the idea of Europe. So their relation to an imagined intellectual community beyond the Middle East, starting with a desire to become part of world culture, in around 1900, which led to the construction of Western-style theaters and Western leisure practices, becoming indigenized in Egypt, the opera house, and so on. That's one kind of imagination of one's relation with Europe. And then it's continued in the 60s with the construction of national theaters that produce Shakespeare, because a serious country should have serious theater, and serious theater means Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth. And then how that moved on in the 70s to really a local theater addressing local concerns through Shakespeare. And then more recently, as state support for theater has dwindled in many Arab countries, and as after September 11th, 2001, Western interest in Arab theater has grown. Suddenly the old audience isn't there anymore, and the old funding sources aren't there, and new ones are. And this provides a kind of mixed blessing, a kind of double-edged opportunity for Arab theater makers to bring Arab theater, and in many cases Arab Shakespeare works very well as a bridge in this regard, but it's a kind of a rickety bridge, and it's one that I'm interested in exploring because it's for a whole new public that doesn't know the Arab theater tradition, doesn't know the language, and has to read the surtitles. So we'll start with the very beginning. The oldest surviving Arabic Hamlet is by this guy, Tanyas Abdul. He's famous as a hack translator who mass produces texts. He churns them out everywhere in coffee shops and in buses and on the roof of his house. And he carries a French novel in one hand and a sheaf of paper in the other, and he writes without rereading or editing or correcting. In other words, he's a terrible translator. And he's working closely to produce theater texts because Cairo's new theaters need scripts, and Shakespeare is just script fodder. This guy down here, Sheikh Salema Hegezi, is an opera singer. He's a vocalist star, and when at age 49 he plays Hamlet, so he's a little old for the role, The crowd loves it. Several songs have been introduced into the script just for him. And when one day he tries to perform it without singing, the crowd allegedly riots. So this is a kind of stereotypical story of bad early Shakespeare. And people have been beating up on Tanyas Abdu for 100 years. He's part of a series of Arab Shakespeare adaptations of this period that all do roughly the same thing. His Hamlet is especially hilarious because it introduces some things that aren't in Shakespeare, such as an early love scene that has Hamlet and Ophelia flirting, and he calls her his divine angel, you know, much as he does in Shakespeare. It's noticeable in Shakespeare's Hamlet, you never see the couple together. You never see Hamlet and Ophelia together being happy, how their relationship should have been, except in flashback. So he gives us that. Especially famous is the happy ending on his production, where Hamlet not only defeats Claudius, but survives to assume the throne while the ghost renders judgment on everyone and the other characters applaud and sing a hymn from the wings. He says, "As for you, Hamlet," this is the ghost, right, coming back to render judgment and restore order. "As for you, Hamlet, live happy on earth, forgiven in heaven. Ascend before my eyes to your uncle's place, for this throne was created only for your majesty." So many, for instance, Arab graduate students writing dissertations in faculties of English in various universities in the US and UK have taken the opportunity to lambaste this guy for being a terrible translator. What they didn't know was he was a pretty good translator, but not of Shakespeare. This character on the left is Alexandre Dumas, whom you might know from The Count of Monte Cristo or The Three Musketeers and so forth. He was incredibly popular in turn-of-the-century Cairo and Alexandria, where the literary scene depended a lot on Francophone Syrian and Lebanese immigrants producing texts for theaters for this new Egyptian middle class. So it turns out that Dumas' text explains a lot that's wrong. So a lot that the critics have blamed on Arab backwardness of Tanyas Abdu and his audience is actually due to French hyper-propriety, right? French neoclassical sense of order. Justice has to be done. The hero can't die in the end. You can't show a couple breaking up if you haven't shown them together. And sort of these are all just French assumptions about what theater should be, filtered through Dumas. His Hamlet also survives at the end, although it's more ambiguous than in Abdu. He survives. It's not clear if that's a reward or a punishment, but the last words of the play are, "Tu vivras," you will live. And so, of course, we don't know this. No one has ever bothered to discover it before, not because it was difficult, but because Abdu didn't emphasize it. This is his title page. It says, "The story of Hamlet, a play in 5 acts authored by Shakespeare, the renowned English poet. Arabized by the skilled writer Tanyas Effendi Abdu," he's emphasizing his Ottoman title of Effendi, right? "Owner of the reputable newspaper, Sharq." So the one name that's not on this title page is Dumas, obviously. You can tell how Shakespeare is being used here as a sort of legitimating name, but in fact, Dumas is a much more appropriate writer to the context. He's interested in social justice also. And so using him and his plays that have a kind of radical reputation in Cairo and Beirut and Alexandria in this period allows Tanyas Effendi Abdu to have it both ways. He can feed his commercial interests as well as his sort of mildly leftist, slightly radical political sympathies at the same time. And then his play reads a little bit like opera, so the soliloquies, the monologues are not soliloquies, they're kind of arias. They're very repetitive. And one of them, several of them, he actually publishes later in his poetry diwan, his collection of poetry in 1925. So they feed his literary ambitions as well. That's the first and earliest form of Shakespeare exploitation in the Arab context. Then it takes a turn for the political with the movement to free Egypt from, first from British colonial rule. The interesting thing is that it can support completely different readings of the same play as long as the general thrust is anti-colonial. It doesn't matter, you know, if you turn it on its head or on its feet or what. These are two productions of Julius, or two versions of Julius Caesar. The one on the left, from 1912 is identified as being by William Shakespeare, الشاعر الروائي الإنجليزي الديمقراطي, the democratic literary poetic English writer. So if you're quoting an English writer, he has to have good democratic bona fides. And that's because the introduction to this 1912 translation portrays Julius Caesar as somehow akin to the despotic British rulers. This is building up to the 1919 revolution. In 1935, the guy on the right, Gamal Abdel Nasser, whom you might also recognize, plays Caesar too at his high school. His high school puts on a production of Julius Caesar, and Nasser stars as theater, and this time as Caesar. And this time, Caesar is the anti-British hero, not the symbol for the British. He's the liberator of the masses and victor over Britain, because this is one of the things that Julius Caesar did. Was that Rome subdued England, and so that is emphasized on the playbill, and it's produced at his high school in Cairo, and many members of the cultural and political elite attend, including the Minister of Education, whom Nasser's revolution will later unseat. And Nasser, you can trace in the rhetoric of Gamal Abdel Nasser some Caesarisms, some tendencies to identify himself with the state. He learned his rhetorical lessons from this Shakespeare performance at age 16 pretty effectively. I don't know how many of you have done theater in high school, but store it away, keep it. It might be useful. And Nasser's whole self-presentation, of course, throughout his rule, depended not only on turning himself into a hero and liberator of the masses, but on substituting stagecraft instead of statecraft. It was really a rule by image production. This is a picture of him in Damascus about 3 months before Syria and Egypt divorced and broke up the United Arab Republic. He was visiting the University of Damascus, and they were producing, of course, a good anti-Zionist play, The Merchant of Venice. And so this is him being photographed with the cast there at center stage, and they're really looking at him like he's the leading man, and not Shylock. This brings us to Nasser's 1960s. And this was a unique period. Well, they're all unique periods. They're all periods of globalization. This period its globalization had a particular shape. And that shape was captured by the Egyptian-British novelist Ahdaf Soueif. Later, she wrote a memoir where she said, in the 60s, on any given night in Cairo, you could go see an Arabic, English, French, Italian, or Russian film. There was culture coming in from every direction. This isn't the post-colonial situation of Caliban sitting there for, Prospero to teach him language so he can learn how to curse. This is the opposite. This is an overpopulated field. This is the situation of Hamlet, who has too many father figures. Who's my dad? Is it the ghost? Is it Polonius? Is it Claudius? It's too much. It's overdetermined input, and so the thing is to decide what you're going to use and how. And the particular example that Ahdaf Soueif chooses to make this point is the example of Hamlet, that you could have any flavor of Hamlet. You could have strawberry Hamlet or chocolate Hamlet. You could have the Russian Hamlet at Cinema Odeon, or Christopher Plummer's BBC Hamlet at Cinema Qasr al-Nil. You could have Karamutawa's Hamlet at the National Theater, and we didn't worry about it, she said. No, of course they did worry about it. This is Nasser with the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev at the christening of the official launch of Phase 1 of the Aswan High Dam. So theater in post-colonial Egypt has gone through 3 distinct phases. And the first was this feeling of euphoria and national pride of, look, we're a real serious country, we have real culture, we can do theater. Then there was a period after Nasser's death of, oh, what happened, what's been betrayed. This is where my book kind of got interested in the problem of Shakespeare's Prince and Nasser's ghost. And Nasser being cast in the role of Hamlet's father as the great leader whose vision you can't be faithful to because it's not possible in the world, but at the same time, you can't turn your back on it either. And then that went sour pretty quickly, and so for the last quarter of the 20th century, There were some ironic productions, which I'll talk about. But yes, this was the Russian Hamlet at the Cinema Odeon. It was a film directed by Grigory Kozintsov. It's an amazing film. I encourage you to watch it. It's black and white. It's very heavy. It's not subtle. The score is by Dmitry Shostakovich. And the acting is also not subtle. And this Hamlet is really, he's Pasternak's Hamlet. They use Pasternak's translation. And he's so the author of Dr. Zhivago, very preoccupied with the question of the autocratic regime and what the decent, honest, authentic intellectual is supposed to do about it. And that comes, and so he's not, you know, this isn't Laurence Olivier's man who could not make up his mind. This is a Hamlet who really fights the autocratic and brutal and corrupt regime as much as he can, and of course ends the way that the script of Hamlet says he has to. And this film, not because it was Soviet, being Soviet made it available in 1960s Cairo, but that didn't automatically make it interesting. What made it interesting was these local resonances that audiences saw in it. There are statues of Claudius all over that start cropping up more and more in portraits of Claudius as the film goes on. There are these pictures of starving peasants kind of discreetly in the background of some scenes. And so there are things that the Egyptian audience, even not understanding the Russian text, could not ignore that spoke to their own time. And so when 700 people attended a lecture on Kozintsov's Hamlet in Cairo, Theater Magazine at the time in Cairo was like, this is more people than would attend any play. What are all these people doing in the audience for a panel discussion? It's because the conversation about the Russian Hamlet was channeling some current political debates, and there were different leftist groups taking different opinions about the Shakespeare text in the discussion. And in a typical Cold War moment, 1964, of course, was the, what was it? The anniversary, the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth. And so all around the world there were celebratory, commemorative types of events in which different countries said, yes, yes, we're also part of the world that cares about Shakespeare. And so that's where Kozintsov's film came from in 1964. And also that year, the Egyptian National Theater did a production of Hamlet. And the critics openly wrote about this Cold War dilemma. What choice is the producer going to make? Is he going to go toward the more contemplative, you know, British Hamlet, or toward the more feisty and serious, action-oriented Russian, Soviet Hamlet? And in the end, he kind of tried to thread a middle path and disappointed everybody. So the Soviet example was stored away. It wasn't metabolized for immediate use. It was kept until it came in handy. It came in handy after Nasser died in 1970. And then there was really the moment of, oh, my father is calling me to be faithful to his legacy, but I can't. I'm under Sadat. I'm under the next leader of Egypt. My country has changed its priorities. It is turning toward the West. It's turning away from socialism. It's betraying the legacy I was raised in and grew up venerating. And then it's this Hamlet moment of, well, the times have moved on, and you know the king is telling you to dry your eyes, but this king is also a murderer, and so what do you do? And in that moment, there was a very resonant Hamlet produced by this megalomaniacal actor, director, Mohammad Sobhi, who really produced him as a vehicle for his own stardom, and he played Hamlet. You can watch the whole thing online. It's on the Global Shakespeare's website at MIT, globalshakespeares.org. You can see, it's almost unwatchable today. He plays Hamlet as a kind of Che Guevara in doublet and hose, fighting for justice and freedom with integrity and honor. Sobhi told me in an interview that he had seen this Russian film 17 times. When it was screening in Cairo, he would run around. Oh, it's playing at the Odeon. Oh, wait, it's playing at the Russian Cultural Center. It's playing at the Czech Cultural Center. It's playing at the Italian Cultural Center, and catch this film everywhere he could. And you can see that in his production. Other people saw it too, but then as the times changed, they used it differently. This is what I mean about the local utility of the thing being different. And so there was a range of satirical adaptations where the king has no conscience, where a play can't stab, where play is not a weapon, where Hamlet is an alcoholic intellectual, where the king's conscience is not aroused by the performance of a political theater adaptation, which after all is Hamlet's game too, and it doesn't work. So there was this period of dark satirical adaptations. Not coincidentally, the audience at these got smaller and smaller until it was the director and his 10 friends. The theater circuit, I mean, it's still bigger. Theater's still more important in Arab countries than it is, for instance, in my country, in the United States. More people go see it and talk about it. But it was a huge decline from its massive public importance in the 1960s. And so in the next phase, with the state theater circuit really very difficult to work on, theater has been festivalized. And I'm just going to run very, very quickly through some of the interesting things that have happened in the last 18 years or so. This playable surface thing is the Kuwaiti-born director, Suleyman al-Bassam, who I interviewed him. I said, how can you do this? How can you make theater for people who don't know Arabic? Why are you making Arabic theater for them? You're fluent in English, your mom is British, you write in English, your whole culture is English. Why are you doing this? Why are you giving the Royal Shakespeare Company Richard III production in Arabic so that the audience can sit there like cows, you know, flipping their heads between the stage and the surtitles? And he says, well, you have to work with their agenda as long as it's a playable surface. And this playable surface for me, this is the rickety bridge. This is the deck of the ship that's, you know, taking your wares for sale from here to there, because this is the only way to make a living and to make a play, to make theater. So in 2002, Al-Bassam produces this Al-Hamlet Summit that was really geared toward a Western public. It's the first one in which the settings are overtly Islamic and that really says this is a play set in an Arab place. None of the Arab plays made for Arab audiences needed to do that. They could just do Shakespeare in any costumes, in jeans or Elizabethan, you know, whatever. And the public would know. But here, the public had to be told, well, this is a play about an Arab context. And so Hamlet has to speak in this Oriental voice, I, Hamlet, son of Hamlet, to sound like people thought an Arab should sound. Ophelia has to, she can't just drop herself in the river, she has to become a suicide bomber. And this play was, of course, a roaring success and won Al-Bassam commissions all over the place, including the first ever Arabic production at the BBC, which was Richard III, an Arab tragedy. This is my interview with Al-Bassam, where I push him on these things, and he says, you have to conform to their agenda as long as it's a playable surface. We actually published this. And so then there are various other adaptations, local and global. I can talk to you about this. There's a very good one in Cairo in 2009 that kind of brings Hamlet home to the Egyptian cultural scene. There's actually a film Hindi that takes the ideas from the Al-Hamlet Summit, and then the screenwriter writes to me and says, oh, thank you so much for introducing me to Al-Bassam's work and seeing how a political Hamlet can work. Okay, so England is totally out of the picture here. This is an Arabic play via Boston to Kashmir. Then there's the Arab Spring. There are World Shakespeare Festivals, most notably in London. There are productions, again, made for mixed audiences, for Arab and Western audiences. And there's a Macbeth about the uprising in Tunisia. There's a Richard II that was actually not in Palestinian Arabic. It was in very, very good classical Arabic. There's a South Sudan theater company that was formed specifically for this festival. So there's this period where Arabic Shakespeare doesn't exist much in the Arab world for Arab audiences. It's being brought into being by Western interest in Arab theater. And most recently, last Friday in Berlin, I saw a play that was partly in Arabic, partly in German, a little bit in English, by the Exile Theater Company, which is a venture of the Gorky Theater, this kind of cutting-edge theater in Berlin. This Exil company is led by Eham Majid Agha, He introduced some of his own texts into the show, and it wasn't a production of Hamlet. It was a production of Heiner Müller's Hamlet Machine. I hope you're not forcing this on your students in your adaptations class. It's a very difficult text, and it has weighed down generations of German school students since it was first produced in 1977. This play is 40 years old, and it asks about the role of the intellectual on the ruins of Europe. I mean, it's asking about the ruins of that Europe. It's asking about the Cold War and questions between Eastern and Western Europe. Heiner Müller is an East German writer. And it's asking what should the intellectual do, again, after public protest has failed to accomplish meaningful political change, after Hungary 1956, after Prague 1968, after so many strivings for freedom by different people in different times have been squashed. It's an incoherent, very difficult play. The text is about 6 pages long. The production took 10 hours. So the original, not the one I watched, thank God. So the one I watched took about an hour and a half, and it was this mixed Arab, mostly Arab, and I think one Afghan woman who spoke Dari, and I think someone was Palestinian, mostly Syrian, cast. They did it in clown suits, and they really did what Heiner Müller had had in mind. So they presented the same text from different sides with different performance styles and different languages. And the play was very aggressive. There was a very loud sort of rock and roll or Arab pop soundtrack. So the text was very much get away from me. But the subtext, I think, was entirely the opposite. It was, we are here and we belong here. We can play with the German Hamlet tradition as well or better than you can. We can play with Heiner Müller. And this is a new form, a new kind of Arabic theater, being created of necessity in places of exile, because that's where the time and money and leisure to attend to theater are partly now located. There's also Arabic Shakespeare being produced in other places, for instance in Lebanon, that I'm happy to talk about. But I thought this form was a particularly interesting new phase. In a way, it brings us back around to where we started, where Arab actors, writers, and directors are saying, yes, the European theater tradition, we can be part of it. It is for us, too. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. So our first respondent is Ethan Guagliardo, who is assistant professor in the Department of Western Languages and Literatures at Boğaziçi University. Professor Guagliardo's recent research is concerned with the political in the early modern period, specifically the way that writers like Shakespeare engage with changing ideas of authority, imagining new ways of conceptualizing the experience of encountering authority, both political and divine. So I'll invite.
Okay. Hi. Nice to see so many students here. In Margaret's work, the Arab Hamlet is first and foremost a collective Hamlet, a figure who sums up the problem of Arab nationhood after Ottoman and Western imperialism. The problem, in her words, of national self-determination and authenticity. The Arab Hamlet is decisively not the prophet of self-consciousness and interiority celebrated by the Romantics and psychologized by the likes of Sigmund Freud, Laurence Olivier, and Mel Gibson. Yes. This primarily political Hamlet maps wonderfully onto Margaret's theory of globalized and kaleidoscopic adaptation. The modern adapter of Hamlet, in whatever context, is not a singular and isolated figure grappling over the problem of the original source text, like the Romantic Hamlet grappling with the problem of acting in a complicated world. Rather, the modern adapter is someone who already comes to a Hamlet mediated by a wide and diverse array of responses. Both the process of adaptation itself and the Arab product are already, in a deep sense, collective. What we have here, then, is not only a theory of Shakespearean adaptation, but also a possible answer to the following question. What is it about Shakespeare, and about Hamlet in particular, that keeps us coming back? It is not Shakespeare, nor the text of Hamlet per se. Rather, we need merely apply Occam's razor to see that what keeps us coming back is the oversaturated and globalized arena of Shakespeare mediation itself, what is sometimes called the Shakespeare industry, topped with the cherry of intellectual and cultural prestige that the name of Shakespeare confers. Now, this is all surely true. And so, while I don't want to insist on the original play here, I nevertheless do think that the original insists on us. What I mean is that there is something about the way this antiquated play, Hamlet, deals with the fundamental problems of politics, and particularly the problem of political authority, that remains irrepressibly and hauntingly modern. I begin, however, in true Hamlet-like fashion with a detour via Twitter, through a very different context of Shakespearean adaptation. A student of Maggie Vinter from Case Western University found the following titles for Chinese translations of Hamlet. The usurper of state power, usurps supreme power and snatches the sister-in-law. Deep hatred, kills the elder brother and snatches the sister-in-law. And the best of the bunch, arch-careerist brings calamity on the country. Beyond noting the remarkable interest in snatching sisters-in-law, I can only offer brief and vague suggestions about how Hamlet reads in the Chinese context. What we notice here is a very political Hamlet, privileging enmity against a corrupt and false authority. Claudius here is the star of the show. Now, I don't bring up the Chinese Hamlet simply for the sake of humor. Although they may seem funny to us, these titles actually have a very old authority on their side. I now travel from east to west, to the first iteration of global Shakespeare, namely the German Shakespeare. Germany has had a very long love affair with Shakespeare, and with Hamlet in particular. In fact, the romantic Hamlet is by and large a German export. Yet the title of Germany's earliest adaptation from the 17th century looks a lot like our Chinese versions. This is the first, this is at the top, the Brudermord, the brother murder punished. It would not be until after the Romantic turn that a very different political Hamlet would appear. Hamlet as representative of German nationhood. Deutschland ist Hamlet was the rallying cry of the poet Freiligrath in 1844, calling on Germany to take arms against the Sea of Troubles and capture its rightful place among European nations. Strangely then, the notion of a collectivized national Hamlet is born here, in conjunction with the solitary Hamlet of German Romanticism, the Hamlet sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. On the other hand, though, it's not that surprising if we consider that nationalism emerges in the 19th century as one belated arm of Romanticism itself. In any case, Germany would find its Fortinbras, its conquering hero in Otto von Bismarck. The trouble is that the young Fortinbrases of the world all die eventually, and once posthumous, they tend to become old Hamlets. That is, they tend to become ghosts. Indeed, in this picture, the living Bismarck already looks something like the ghost of old Hamlet, armed in complete steel. Not too long after the First World War ended in 1918, German National Socialists, and make no mistake, the Nazis loved their Hamlet, would see in the play an image of their struggle to recapture national glory lost. This struggle, of course, failed, but in response, a leading Nazi philosopher and jurist, Carl Schmitt, would turn Hamlet into an ironic myth for a collective and creeping global rot of the soul. In a note dated November 11, 1956, that is Armistice Day, Schmitt plotted Western history along what he called the Hamlet curve. In Schmitt's Hamlet apocalypse, the problem is that humanity grows more Hamlet-like over time. That is, more wavering, more unable to grapple with the ghost of past authority. Ironically, humanity at its most collective becomes to look like the individual Hamlet of Romanticism. Oh, sorry. Let me just read this. 1848, Germany is Hamlet. 1918, Europe is Hamlet. 1958, the Western world is Hamlet. As you can see, creeping. Okay, and so I return to the play, to its particular qualities that make Hamlet such a fruitful sounding board for thinking through politics, the nature of consciousness and action, and perhaps the grander topic of national destiny, and sometimes all three at once. It is, I think, the way the play joins politics with the problem of the political as such. That is, the problem of the foundations of politics, of joining political action to norms of justification. This is, as I've already mentioned, the problem of political authority. Now, of course, Hamlet is far from Shakespeare's only play to grapple with authority. But whereas in King Lear, for example, the great image of authority is a dog obeyed in office, in Hamlet, this image is the more potent figure of the ghost, whose appearance does violence to the regular course of nature and the customary patterns of experience. Unlike other early modern revenge tragedies in which ghosts appear, the ghost in Hamlet is unique because of this violence, this rupture that it represents. In other words, the ghost figures authority not so much as a substance from which one derives solid grounds of political agency, or as a cynical lie to be overthrown, but as a question. Is it, Hamlet asks, a spirit of health, bearing the authority of heaven, or a goblin damned, a demonic pretender like Claudius, who can smile and be a villain? This question is, no doubt, couched in the language and conceptual apparatus of the early modern world, or more precisely, the world in the wake of Reformation-era contests for authority. How could one recognize and experience true political authority in a world where demonic forces could work disguised as popes and as Protestant kings? And how could one take action without clear authorization from heaven? Or to put the matter in more secular terms, without clear justification? Or worse, when one looks, when what looks and feels like clear justification is all the more suspicious precisely because it appears just right, like a father armed in complete steel. And yet, Hamlet shows, tragically, that action is necessary and urgent all the same. Claudius is obviously a corrupt usurper, and something must be done. In adapting Hamlet for ourselves, we can choose to emphasize either horn of the dilemma, the corruption of Claudius and hence the heroic urgency of action, or the question of authority, politics, or the political. Of course, some of us in the modern world are too wise to believe in ghosts, and there are some wiser still who know authority to be merely a fiction, or else, and this amounts to the same thing, a performative effect of ideology and the practices of social and political life. But it may be that the ghost still believes in us, though perhaps it can be hoped that our ghost will not be one that comes in complete steel, but will rather remain the play itself, our original and our contemporary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ethan. Our second respondent is İnci Bilgin Tekin, who is assistant professor in the program in Advanced English at Boğaziçi University. Professor Bilgin Tekin's work is focused on modern European and American drama, as well as the translation, appropriation, and adaptation of Shakespearean theater on the Turkish stage. İnci, thank you for joining us.
Right. Well, indeed, being very inspired by your talk, Margaret, I decided to, I questioned indeed the theatrical, historical, the history of theater in Turkey. Sorry about my terrible voice, by the way, I'm suffering from a terrible flu. And I just realized there's a big historical relevance. So, for instance, in Turkey, it starts with Tanzimat, and Shakespeare has always become a symbol of Westernization back then. And in the 1960s, post-1960s period, it gets into a more indigenizing context. Sorry? Okay. Another important aspect of Turkish theater history is indeed it reflects on Turkish identity, cultural identity, because Turkish literary dialogue with Shakespeare has always been located on an ambivalent axis. Turkish cultural identity being a hybrid of being a Westerner and an Easterner, half European and half Middle Eastern. In Homi Bhabha's definition, hybridity as the one and the other both, while at the same time neither one nor the other, but something else besides contests, the terms and territories of both. So the history of adaptation in Turkish literary history, as I mentioned, dates back to Tanzimat, the English word connotation of which is reorganization and usually received as a period of westernization, right followed by the first constitutional period. Tracing the Turkish literary background, one can argue that from Tanzimat onwards, adapting a canonical Western source text to the Turkish audience has become a problematic issue manipulated by the ongoing political debate of Westernization versus Easternization. Therefore, I would like to focus on several adaptations which I consider noteworthy. One of them is the 1930s Anatolian performances of Othello as Arap'ın İntikamı, The Revenge of the Arab, which you might find maybe interesting. But unfortunately, we have no records of that. But indeed, it reflects on the cultural ambivalence of the Turkish identity. While indeed Turkey projects itself as the other of the West on the one hand and the other of the East on the other hand, the dialogue with Othello becomes even more problematic, especially if you think about Othello's war in Cyprus. It becomes more problematic. So after 1960s, there is an interesting project going on in Turkey, which I believe, again, is political. It's again about Westernization trend in Turkey. That is Female Hamlet project, started by Hüseyin Ertuğrul. It dates back to, indeed, before then. You'll mention also, I guess, but Ayla Algan, you know, the very famous Turkish actress, was there on the stage playing a female Hamlet. And the play, indeed, definitely shows the Westernization discourse because it draws on the performance, the silent film version of Aslı Nielsen. And there are big similarities. In 1960s period, that's quite important a period in the history of Turkey, the political history of Turkey at the same time. So there are critics, you know, suggesting that the way the actress Ayla Algan performs Hamlet, because that's a male character Hamlet, though a female actress, you know, plays Hamlet, that's not female Hamlet. The project is Female Hamlet project, but the character is a male Hamlet. It looks on the stage as a soldier. Okay, so I find it quite interesting. So after 1960s, there's a second trend after 1960s to indigenize Shakespeare. That's no longer adaptations, but we start with a period of appropriations after that. So adaptations are no more loyal adaptations. Also appropriations are being introduced after 1960s. Also there are loyal adaptations, but I mean appropriations start in post-1960s period with the understanding of indigenizing Shakespeare. That I believe also is parallel to the 1960s Constitution, right after that. So to mention among these indigenous versions, I would like to refer to Can Yücel, a prominent Turkish translator and poet, and his versions of Hamlet and also Midsummer Night's Dream. So it's a new project. There we see Hamlet, you know, uttering the lines "to be or not to be" in the form of a classical Turkish song. So we see that's indigenized Shakespeare. Also, right after 1970s, also in Bahar Noktası, that is the Midsummer Night's Dream. After that, we move on to another striking example, that is the Metin Erksan film version of Kadın Hamlet. So still the Female Hamlet project is going on Turkish this time screen instead of stage. And there also the context is thoroughly indigenized, and it is a contemporary version. The names are kept, in Turkish names, while only Hamlet, is kept as Hamlet. For instance, Ophelia is Orhan, and Rosenkranz and Guildenstern we see as Rezan and Gül. So that shows the modern, way of life in Turkey. So the context is quite contemporary, but still, Westernization, discourses go side by side with that film adaptation. Another noteworthy adaptation, which is less known, but before then I think I should also, because it's a political one, I should also mention another 1970s adaptation. Sorry about that. Beklan Algan's Hamlet, 70. Their Hamlet is a leftist Republican fighting the imperialist. That's also a noteworthy version, a stage version. And after that, I want to move on to a 1991 Macbeth, Muhitimizi Uyarlama Denemesi by Ümit Kıvanç. This is a lesser known version. There indeed, the whole context is 1980s political context. So Macbeth rises from a party secretary to a party leader, and he finally falls with the military takeover in 1980s. And it's a very striking version. Because then the witches, the prophecy of the witches is indeed the mass media. So I find it quite relevant to contemporary discussions as well. I would like to also note that now we have more of Macbeth, or Hamlet, Macbeth, like Shakespeare we have in general means more indigenized. And then it reflects again on the self-reflection as, at the crossroads between an Easterner and a Westerner. We still tend to adapt Shakespeare on the one hand. We remember. On the other hand, we, have a break from this canonically significant figure. On the other hand, because that's the canonical other. On the other hand, of the Eastern aspect. So Graham Holderness's lines I find very relevant to today's discussions. Shakespeare is no longer the personal Shakespeare, no longer the writer, but Shakespeare is the myth. It's a myth. Shakespeare is a myth, is an icon, signifier of the whole literature, world literature. So a very important signifier for the Turkish literary history as well. Shakespeare is here now, always. What is currently being made of him, says Graham Holderness. And I would like to conclude with another quotation. Shakespeare will never allow you to bury him or escape him or replace him. We have almost all of us thoroughly internalized the power of Shakespeare's plays, even without having attended them or read them ourselves. From health. Sorry about my terrible voice again.
Thank you. And our final, last but not least, respondent is Melis Günekan, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Western Languages and Literatures, currently hard at work on a dissertation on Shakespeare's role in Turkish theater. Günekan's work seeks to map the terrain that is Turkish Shakespeare, how authors have received and engaged with Shakespeare's texts, as well as how they've seen their concerns, their aspirations, and their self-identifications reflected on Shakespeare's surface. So, Melis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be among you as the youngest member of the group. So basically, this is a still going on work, so excuse my enthusiasm and anxiety about it. So very much, I think, relevant and very inspiring to what you've been all telling about Shakespeare and political Shakespeare so far. So in Turkish theater, we actually see that from the half of the 20th, from the mid-20th century onwards, we have a rising interest in integrating political concerns, activist concerns into theater here in Shakespeare adaptations. So especially since 1980s, as Inji was also talking, independent theater productions have focused on state violence, government corruption, power struggle, and broadly speaking, minority status here in Turkey. Yet, these dynamics of filtering Shakespeare's original play through these local concerns, of course, changes from each case, from one case to another. But when we... Okay, better like this? Okay, tamam. But the overall tendency here to address local theater urges us to think about Shakespeare's authority in Turkish theater, because from late Ottoman and Republican theater history, starting from late Ottoman period until now, we see that staging Shakespeare, translating Shakespeare, adapting Shakespeare's work was predominantly actualized as part of the modernizing projects. So there was a conscious choice in using theater practice as a political agency. If this is the case, post-1980 cases of Shakespeare adaptations in Turkish theater reflect a desire to engage in locality and in state politics, but at the same time a wish to grapple with the authority of the name Shakespeare, or the brand name Shakespeare. So far I have worked on several contemporary cases, and what I want to focus at the moment is two contemporary cases of Hamlet adaptations we have. One is from Boğaziçi University Performance Arts Ensemble, BGST, called Kim Var Orada, who is there. This case, this play was first staged in 2015. This emergence is an important case because this play examines the intertwined impact of Shakespeare and the famous founder of modern Turkish theater, Muhsin Ertuğrul, and their theatrical activity, the activity of directing and administering theater in Republican Turkey. So, in the context of early 20th century Turkey, Muhsin Ertuğrul represents the paradox of theater practice that is conducted under conditions of national surveillance, even as this surveillance is justified in the name of liberating ideals of secularism and republicanism. So, in the play, hopefully some of you might have already seen it, two ghosts approach Muhsin Ertuğrul, who is writing his memoirs at that point. These ghosts are two Armenian theater practitioners. One is a female, one is a male, and the female is actually a Muslim theater practitioner disguised under a female Armenian female identity so that she can practice theater in late Ottoman period. So in the play they approach Muhsin Ertuğrul, and they recognize to be remembered and marked by Muhsin Ertuğrul, who is today recognized as our modern Turkish theater father. So even though Armenian theater companies in the late Ottoman period were among the first practitioners of European forms of theater, as well as the first producers of Shakespeare's plays, their heritage was disregarded in establishing the liberating ideals of the Republic. So against this broader background of Turkish theater history, the figure of Shakespeare signals the indeterminate relationship between an elite Western or European culture and a local Ottoman one, a relationship that further involves the complexity of the long ignored cultural heritage of non-Muslim communities, who were regarded as local foreigners as opposed to authentic Ottoman Turks at the time. So, in this context, Kim Var Orada focuses on this transitional period from the second constitutional era of the Ottoman Empire to the early years of the Republic, a time when Ertuğrul played a key role in the realization of the cultural transformations of nation-state building and republican ideals. So when we see these two ghosts on stage, the famous Armenian actor Vahram Papazyan and the fictional Muslim actress called Latife approaching Ertuğrul, he is in that moment of writing his memoirs. So maybe when you have seen this, the beginning of the play, we see this case that Ertuğrul is writing the names and listing them on and on and on. And in the end, he starts with his own German heritage, censoring what he's been writing about Shakespeare and foreign institutionalization of theater by totally ignoring and crossing out names rather than telling us what was happening at the time. So in that respect, a focus on Shakespeare today allows us to notice that in the context of the late 19th century Ottoman Empire, the so-called East-West duality was reproduced between Muslims and non-Muslims, where the non-Muslims came to embody the West within at the time, and where the Muslim Ottoman citizens came to embody the real locals. And Shakespeare had a great role in this, because Shakespeare was, theater was based on European examples, specifically French examples, but from England, Shakespeare was the name constantly adopted and rewritten and paraphrased and summarized at the time. So all this political concern with building a new theater, ironically called Ottoman theater, Turkish theater, but very much westernized and Europeanized theater, had a great influence as part of the Armenians and the Greek population here. So that's why they are so much intertwined into each other, that today in our theater practice, in our political theater practice, it is no longer possible to ignore these dynamics when we look at the stage. So that's why I think Kim Var Orada, who is there by Boğaziçi Ensemble, is a really good example in this sense, to go back to these times and reconsider our historiography and our cultural heritage. I have another case, but I think it will be too much. Maybe in Q&A I can. Okay then, very briefly, my other case is Moda Sahnesi's Hamlet production, which was first staged in 2013 when there was the Gezi Park protests here in Turkey. So Moda Sahnesi builds a parallelism between the Hamlet figure and the political background of the Gezi Park protests, and situates the play around the idea of defying state politics as well as defying the authority of Shakespeare. So I think this is a very interesting case, because when you look at the website of the company, for example, you see that while they were rehearsing Hamlet at the time, 2013, they were constantly reinserting the phrase Hamlet örgütlenmektir, which sort of translates as Hamlet is to come together and organize, Hamlet is about solidarity, Hamlet is about fighting against state violence. So they were sort of taking the political background at one hand and taking Shakespeare's authority and their anxiety of influence over Shakespeare at another hand, and trying to come up with a production which is localized as far as it can, with the checkered suite and the then Prime Minister's embodiment on stage, and with Shakespeare's sort of ghost off stage, where in the rehearsal notes Shakespeare calls and says, "Hey guys, do you have the skull at your hand? Are you gonna use that scene or not? Oh no, don't worry, Shakespeare just leaves us a message." So this still ambivalent but very important dynamic again calls us to reconsider our relationship, our political relationship and consideration with Shakespeare today. So thank you, excuse my enthusiasm.
Okay, thank you. That is unbelievable how well everybody stuck to their time limit. So we are perfectly on schedule and have time for questions, at least 20 minutes, if not more. So I would like to open this up to our panelists to see if you would like to respond to one another, and also open it up to the audience to see if there are lingering questions that you would like to ask us about Hamlet in the Arab world, the kind of dynamics that Margaret has been underlining, the replication of East-West dualities in the context of Turkish theater. Across the board, the idea of Hamlet as being not only the solitary figure, but a synecdoche for a larger community, whatever that community might be. All of these questions we can kind of come back to. So.
Can I start just to clarify? I have a question for Inci and Melis both. So in Arabic theater, Shakespeare is not coded as foreign. He is not perceived as other or Western or English anymore for at least half a century. He's been domesticated, and Hamlet especially. So what you're saying makes it sound different, that there's still an anxiety of influence, and there's still a feeling that the Turkish theater is appropriating Shakespeare rather than just using him because he's on the table as part of the menu. That's interesting. Is that true? Can you talk more about that?
I was working with my first ask why Shakespeare, as you did as well. Why today still Hamlet? Why Hamlet in this political background? So each time what I had as a feedback was this anxiety that the theater practitioner's formation as a theater practitioner and dramaturgical training was so much shaped still with Shakespeare that they are very much excited about how to deal with him. So some call him, yes, Shakespeare, he's our Shakespeare, but some still call him that he's this European Western marker of knowledge that we need to deal with, but at the same time they had practical concerns as well. Shakespeare sells, Shakespeare is the brand name. Of course we're going to do something with Shakespeare.
Yes, another aspect is, especially like in the case of Othello, as I mentioned, for instance, we have not so many adaptations of Othello in Turkey as we have adaptations of other plays by Shakespeare. As I said, I mean, it's a kind of ambivalent identity in Turkey, as I mentioned. I find it quite relevant. Yes, as Melis says, a group of critics, a group of people internalize Shakespeare thoroughly. It's the global Shakespeare, that understanding of Shakespeare. But on the other hand, we have the other group of people who still view that. But it's in the same case, Turkey views itself as its own other. That's the thing. It's not about Shakespeare only. That I mean, despite my terrible voice, I wanted to make that point. Indeed, it's the ambivalent cultural identity anyway, and its reflections of Shakespeare is self-reflection.
Judith.
When Melis first mentioned your work to us, I was a little surprised because thinking of Arabs and Hamlet together is not something that comes to us naturally. So, but then I thought, oh, they wrote about post-colonialism, and it somehow made sense thinking about this, like a post-colonialistic writing from them would make sense. But then I read your book and I was really surprised because, as you said, they don't respond to the British, to the Ottomans by using Hamlet, but they just use Hamlet for their own sakes and to reflect on their own, what is that, politics? I mean, it still doesn't make sense how they can't respond to the oppression from the colonialists and I mean even like Ottomans. I mean it still surprised me, and can you say something about it? I know you don't want to focus on that and you don't focus on the book also, but it doesn't make sense.
So you're interested in how there can be an Arab Hamlet or an Arab Shakespeare that is not all about opposition to...
Yep, not all about, but they don't... There was this play and in your book, and the character says that my father was oppressed by the Ottomans and now I'm oppressed by the Europeans, but he just doesn't work and go on that way. Like I can't. I was surprised by that, like how they didn't, how they just ignored that past and just accept Hamlet in their lives and culture like that.
Yeah, it wasn't ignored. There's always, even when an Arab playwright is adapting a Soviet text, there's always one eye on the West and one eye on Europe. It's just that Shakespeare doesn't belong to Europe. This is what surprised me too when I was doing this research. It surprised me for a good reason, which is that there are very eloquent people like Edward Said. Some of the most articulate voices of post-colonial studies received a particular education. So if you read Edward Said's autobiography, Out of Place, I talk about this a little bit in the book. He read Shakespeare with his mother, and then Shakespeare was more or less stuffed down his throat by British schoolmasters at Victoria College. So he is the exception, not the rule. But he's the very loud and articulate and well-transmitted exception that everybody knows about, for whom Shakespeare really is this Western product that he has to somehow grapple with or, you know, choke on or swallow or do something about. But most people had not received Shakespeare this way. So the first thing is just about history, about the reception history. They had received Shakespeare through this tradition of Arabic appropriation filtered through French, going back to the 1890s. So their parents had been to see these shows, their grandparents. So it wasn't something kind of foisted on them suddenly, except in the case of very special elite people like Yusuf Shaheen, the filmmaker, or Edward Said, or these sort of most articulate voices of post-colonial studies. The Ottoman oppression or the Ottoman rule is in the picture. For instance, a 1912 Egyptian translation of Othello doesn't mention the Turks. It's like Othello is going off to Cyprus to fight some war about something. But in 1912, it was something that they wanted to be discreet about and not offend anybody. But that Othello is played as kind of an Arab nationalist hero. He's very articulate and very dignified, and he never has this nervous breakdown and doesn't fall apart like the Othello we know. I don't know if that answers your question, but I just kind of wanted to throw in some different ways of looking at these relationships between political relations and theater plays.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
In the German case,
The microphone is coming over.
in the German case, I know about how the Germans, especially the Nazis, used Shakespeare's texts such as The Merchant of Venice and where there were Jews to prove their point about the righteousness of their acts, whatever, and what they did in the Second World War. But I was wondering how it connects with Hamlet, because it keeps coming back. I mean, for more than a century, first Germany's Hamlet. Is it all German writers who say Germany is Hamlet, Europe is Hamlet? So why? Like, how does it connect to the Nazi perspective?
Okay, well, that's a complicated question, I guess, but so, I mean, the reason I brought up the German example, because I think it is in such nice dialogue with what Margaret says about the Arab context, where you could think collectivized Hamlet, German Hamlet, right? But also the Nasser as the ghost, and Bismarck in some ways as the ghost, or the previous Reich as the ghost, right? After the defeat of Germany in 1918. From the perspective of people like Carl Schmitt and other Nazis, to answer your specific question, is that Germany had been vacillating with, experimenting with social democracy. The social democrats of the Weimar Republic, of course, are always the great traitors to the ghost, Bismarck, right? The great German imperial project. And that's sort of how Hamlet becomes this kind of symbol for, at least for Schmitt and others, of Germany's failure, right, to take up that mantle after the collapse of the First World War. But from Schmitt's perspective, who is living not only the failure of 1918, but also the failure of the Second World War, and writing this note on Armistice Day, 1956, right? So we can see that his brain is he's still really bothered by all the failures of his life. And he responds to that by expanding the Hamlet myth to overtake the whole Western world. And no doubt, if he were alive today, he would say, 2011, Armistice Day, the Middle East as well. I'm sure he would include, the entire globe, right? So, I think that if that answers your question.
Yeah. So are we to assume that ghost figure is like Bismarck, who unified Germany?
I'm just, that's just a suggestion. Yeah. But I just wanted to have a nice little picture of a ghost-like. Yeah. But yes, I think for a person like Schmidt, you know, if you had to identify the ghost of 1918 with something, would be someone like Bismarck, right?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Other questions? Yeah. All right.
I just want to just underline one thing in my speech. Indeed, when I mentioned, you know, the Othello thing, it was just to mention, indeed, our version of our Arabic Othello. That's something to underline. I find it very stereotyping. But I didn't have time to talk about that aspect. I thought I had little time, then I realized I didn't. Indeed, in the exact translation, Arab'ın İntikamı, is a very stereotypical title. If you translate that into English, that would sound as the vengeance of Arab, or something.
The Arab's revenge.
So a terrible title, so very stereotypical. So what I meant is that half side of Turkish identity, it doesn't reconcile within itself. You see the ambivalent identity, that's what I mean. So it's self-reflection, Eastern self-reflection is there. On the other side, there's the Western self-reflection. And together, it reflects onto the dialogue with Shakespeare. That was the point I wanted to underline, but I'm afraid I couldn't.
So interesting. Does that play exist? Do you have a text for it?
Indeed, no records of that. But I mean, it was in 1930s, performed in Anatolia for quite a long time.
I wonder if we can link this back to a little bit to Firdevs's original question, because it seemed like part of the question was there's something about the colonial, post-colonial analytic that doesn't suffice in trying to understand the story that's being told here, right, about Arab Shakespeare, and about how the sense of influence being transferred is not one of oppressor, oppressee, or influencer, influencee, but instead there's a relationship that also relies on a sense of similarity, that relies on a sense of a shared connection that goes back in time. So it seems as though that in the Turkish version, half of the story is possibly the ambivalence of Turkish identity itself.
That's what I mean.
And then the other half of the connection is the parallel dualities that Melis is talking about, right? Where Shakespeare sits at the center of a number of different dualisms. So one is the dualism of Turkey, whatever broad, vague territory that refers to in the West, and then within the history of Turkish theater itself, the local West, right? Embodied by native minority populations whose connections to the West itself is developing along this imagined register. So something about the figure of Shakespeare in Turkish history keeps replicating dualities, right, across time and in different spaces, such that, again, the colonial analytic doesn't seem to kind of do justice to that, but there needs to be another model, perhaps a version of the kaleidoscope or something else.
Yeah, there are things the kaleidoscope model also doesn't do, and it's kind of an awkward term. The only thing it does is it gives you a set of questions to ask that you might otherwise not think to ask, such as, where did this person get their Shakespeare? You know, I should have started like that. I should have asked each of you sort of, do you remember your first experience with Shakespeare? Do you remember, and then go back before that, to your real first experience with Shakespeare. So not to the first text you read or the first play or film you saw, but to the first time you heard somebody make a Shakespeare joke, say that somebody protests too much, or use some comment with to be or not to be in it. I think that's what the global kaleidoscope is good for, is showing that there is source material coming in all different registers from all different sides. It's not that good for the thing you're talking about, which is really delicate and interesting, which is, what is the status of Shakespeare in a given context for given people? How does knowing that a story has Shakespeare's name on it change the way that story is received? If you staged some Romeo and Juliet that has arranged marriage and family feud and things like this, but you didn't call it Romeo and Juliet, you know, how would that be different than if you said, oh, this is an adaptation of Shakespeare's great play, Romeo and Juliet? And that question, we need better tools to answer.
How many people here have actually seen Kim Var Orada, Muhsin Bey'in Son Hamlet'i? Right? Yes, that's the title. Okay, only one of you. Okay. Okay, so it's the BGST production that continues to be performed actually occasionally on campus as well. Is it?
Oh my God!
Today. Oh,
Today.
perfect. Right. So it's an interesting instance of a characteristic that is very unique to Turkish theater, in that Turkish theater is uniquely obsessed with Turkish theater. So you'll see a lot of plays that are explicitly about the process of playmaking itself, and this constant attempt to self-historicize in a way that exercises ghosts, right, that have been forcefully shed along the way. But the result is not necessarily always doing the work that actors wish for it to do. So there too, I think, what Ethan brought up, the idea of Hamlet as both being about political agency, but also being about learning to live with political authority, right? Learning to develop political actions and live with a new set of political norms. All of those themes end up becoming very central, I think, to the Turkish experience of Shakespeare, of Hamlet especially as well. Other thoughts, other questions?
At the end of your speech, you mentioned that Lebanon was a unique place. Lebanon was a unique place where Arabic theater continued to flourish compared to other Arabic countries. So what makes Lebanon different from these countries, and maybe how could Arabic theater come back from exile at one point?
Yeah, that's a great and painful question. What makes Lebanon different is the lack of a functioning dictatorship. And Beirut right now is culturally a very interesting place. It has also absorbed an astonishing number of Syrian immigrants and refugees. It is nonetheless, the theater scene is, despite all of the kind of social and political and traffic challenges that Beirut has right now, and I haven't been, this is secondhand information from people who have been there recently, I haven't been there since 2005, but for instance, all it really takes is a couple of very active figures who are connected to ideas on one side and to funding on another side. And suddenly things can start to happen. So at Lebanese American University and the American University in Beirut, together there is a kind of collective of people, including theater translators, directors, performers, some students, some professional, and they've done different things. They've done productions of a great Syrian playwright, Abdallah Wannous. They've done the first King Lear ever in Lebanese colloquial Arabic. So this is a recent thing. It required a translation effort, how to translate Shakespeare from classical Arabic and English. They used all kinds of, they probably used French as well, source texts into a speakable, like normal contemporary Lebanese idiom that doesn't sound too television, that doesn't sound too much like a TV talk show, and how to stage this in a way that King Lear is, in a way, even more the paradigmatic Arab play than Hamlet. And I was always surprised why nobody did it. It's about the aging autocrat who doesn't know how to give up power. And so they did a production of this play somewhere in the mountains. They had to bus their audience away from Beirut. They found some beautiful place to do this performance. So there are things happening everywhere. There's also theater happening in Cairo, although it's very hard right now. The censorship has become really intense. There's theater happening in Baghdad, but again, it's difficult. The security conditions aren't always there to rehearse and perform and for the audience to come. Shortly after the American invasion, they were doing theater in Baghdad. They were putting on performances at 2 o'clock in the afternoon because it wasn't safe to be out after dark. So the desire and the ideas and the energy is there, and the political conditions, and just logistical sort of environment sometimes isn't, but people are trying to make the best of it.
Maybe hello, thank you. When was Shakespeare's classical translation into, around what time, what period was Shakespeare's Fusha translations adapted into the colloquial exactly? And is it all common throughout the Arab world?
No, not at all. No, most Shakespeare is still Shakespearean. It's in Fusha, and
so
it's very unusual. So it was translated into Fusha around
classical standard Arabic.
Into literary Arabic, starting in the 1910, 1912 kind of wave of translations. Those were in really literary Arabic. The earlier ones weren't. The script fodder, like Tanya's Abdu, it's in literary Arabic, but it's not very beautiful language. That's not the point. Although, as I showed you, he published it in his diwan. Then there was a wave in the 60s with the Arab League, again saying we have culture. Here's our complete works of Shakespeare as an Arab nationalist project in standard Arabic that's understood in every Arab country. The localizing translations, there have not been many. There have been some Othellos in Egyptian colloquial. There's this King Lear, which they claim was the first ever Lebanese Lear. Viewers don't like it. The Romeo and Juliet in Baghdad, which all I need to tell you is the title, and you know exactly how that play in 2012 is going to go and what it's going to be about, and she's Sunni and he's Shia and whatever. You know exactly what that play is going to look like. And it was in Iraqi colloquial Arabic, and I was talking to an audience member afterwards, and she said, oh yes, the show was very beautiful and interesting. I wish the language had been more Shakespearean, by which she meant, Quranic.
I wonder if that says anything about, since this is a recent phenomenon, apparently, the colloquialization of Shakespeare's Fusha versions, maybe that says anything about the domesticity of Shakespeare in the Arab world, because, how do we distinguish? Because you made a comment to Melis about, or maybe to Inci Bilgin about Shakespeare being completely considered not a foreign figure. So,
no, you're absolutely right. It's a great question. Now that I think about it, he's not part of British imperial culture per se, but he's definitely part of this other thing, world high culture, to which Arab intelligentsia members would aspire. And part of that aspiration is the domestication effort of making him completely ours, but there's always pushback. Audiences never like it, and it never lasts. It never goes beyond a few performances.
I wonder if it might be possible to link that a little bit to the kind of reactions that the Moda Sahnesi Hamlet got. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
This is very limited information, of course. I've just been through my talks with the director. So basically, a major audience criticism is not to be able to see a existential Hamlet, let's say, like not a suffering Hamlet, but a Hamlet who jumps, but a Hamlet who wears orange socks, a Hamlet that carries an apple at hand. So some audience members were very much frustrated by the fact that they didn't see this bodily suffering Hamlet, bodily slow Hamlet, but rather a Hamlet that asks also the audience to reconsider their understanding of Hamlet and Hamlet tradition here, because basically that Hamlet walks through the audience, that Hamlet mocks the to be or not to be speech, and uses puns that asks the audience to sometimes be more attentive about the language itself of the speech and how carried away it may get for the actors as well at one point, which is very interesting, of course, on their part. because they've been, I mean, the company has been digging on the Arden edition of Shakespeare and reading every comment and every other scholarship and European criticism on Shakespeare before preparing this production. That's why it becomes an interesting case, that they were very much conscious about this scholarship and what it amounts to here, I mean.
But they didn't totally bring their audience with them.
No.
They haven't trained the audience yet.
No.
Other questions? Questions or thoughts? So I just wanted to add really briefly, it seems as though that appears to give us one of those examples where the audience's reaction encapsulates some dimension of the phenomenon that Margaret is talking about, right? Where Shakespeare is something that has already kind of been domesticated to a certain extent, right? So when the audience, they're not able to recognize a certain repertoire of bodily action or bodily performance on the stage, part of what's being betrayed is what they know to be their version of Shakespeare. So this means that there is some process of domestication that has taken place throughout, without a clear antagonism, right, to the authoritative original. So it seems like there's a similar kind of dynamic there. Other thoughts or questions? Okay, so I think, and our panelists. So I think that's slowly, I feel like there's a question that's been lingering in the background of this larger conversation and I hesitate to say it out loud. Maybe I'll say it out loud and then just let it linger. Was that going to be?
I don't know what to say, but I know that this is interesting, this difference that everybody's bringing up between the ambiguity, this ambiguous relationship with the bard versus something else that we don't understand why there's not much of a problem, because there is one here as far as I understand in contemporary, adaptations. I don't know what my question is, but I think that question is an interesting one to pursue as a contrast and this is historical, but I also am very curious how this relationship with a classical version of Shakespeare in Turkey and it's the associations with the early Republican period, high culture, more positive attitudes towards the westernization, modernization process, and how those have changed maybe through the 80s and the 90s, and then what's going on now where we're starting to feel a certain nostalgia in certain quarters for that period, which we might not have felt 10 years ago. And how is this affecting, right now as we speak, these adaptations? So it's not a question, but it's just, I see it as a very exciting.
I think that also sometimes depends from cases to cases. That nostalgia, I mean, I haven't digged into archives that much, but as far as I've seen, after the establishment of the Republic and through the 60s, along this 50-60 year period, talking about or seeing Shakespeare, especially in state and city theaters, is about seeing a Renaissance, very much loyal Shakespeare, and that was what was applauded at the time. So that has a huge shift today, even though we still have these examples. Today, what we see on stage is contemporary Shakespeare's, not necessarily localized politically, but still contemporarized very much, as opposed to the understanding of this Renaissance Shakespeare that was very much on stage at the time. And that, of course, has a lot to do with those ideals that have been sort of calling and questioning as liberating at my response, because at the time that was how Shakespeare became a marker of high elite culture at the time, right? Which is not a marker of high elite culture, as well as the Republican ideals at the time, right? So that's not valid, not anymore, I think.
But I shared an office. I wish Jevza Hanım hadn't left. I just shared an office with her for 13 years, and for 13 years I heard her complain about every production of Shakespeare, adaptation, modernization of, and I would love to hear, her rail against the machine right now.
But I think part of what's at stake here is, again, a kind of a broader under analytic paradigmlessness, right? In the sense that just as perhaps the case study that Margaret offers doesn't quite fit into the, again, going back to the first question, the colonial, post-colonial model, here too, right? In the Turkish social sciences, there's a deep distrust or discomfort with that way of explaining a belated modernity, right? How do we explain it if we don't explain it through some sense of a post-colonial retrieval, right, of something that was quote-unquote corrupted by Western influence? So there too, it seems as though there's like potentially a larger kind of analytic question, or maybe not, you're making a face.
Yeah, I'm making a face. No, I'm trying to enter the mind of Jeza Sevgin, and I, you know, and it's a difficult place to be. I say it with pure love in my heart, but I would, you know, I'm not talking from that position. So.
Yeah. There's a question up here, Berkem, and then another question up here. Yes.
Actually, I'm just wondering about your opinion, your personal opinions. Each of you have already mentioned about the qualities that make Shakespeare this appropriating superstar for, you know, all the geographies. But I just wonder about your thoughts on about what makes this conference about Shakespeare. Why are we even talking about Shakespeare? I believe Professor Guagliardo will have thoughts about this because he's very much interested about other early modern writers, because, you know, we can appropriate other writers as well. But what is specifically about Shakespeare? Is it about being this high culture elite writer, or do you really believe in this potential of creating many keywords or themes that we can still apply and reflect on our lives? So this is a broad question, I know, but why Shakespeare?
Well, partly, I mean, Shakespeare because Shakespeare, right? I mean, there's a mountain of Shakespeare tradition. If you set out to adapt Middleton, people would have nothing to hang that on. It wouldn't relate to anything else that they've seen or heard. There would be no tradition. No one would have even seen one of the plays before. You would have, whereas with Shakespeare, you have this enormous mountain of references to stand on. I could ask anybody in most of the world, anybody over the age of 12, you know, what do you think of when you hear the word Hamlet? And they'll go like this. There's material to work with, and I feel a little bit guilty about this. I teach a course on, it's called Global Shakespeares at my university, and I'm adding to this mountain, right? I'm in problematizing Shakespeare. I'm actually not so interested in problematizing Shakespeare. Of course, he's one writer who has produced one body of work. I'm more interested in excavating that mountain and seeing what are the treasures that different people have buried in there over time. You couldn't do this with just any writer. The body of work has to be rich enough to support it. I don't think there's going to be a world Harry Potter tradition in 100 years.
Oh.
Although, see, so maybe you could do it with just any writer. But it has to be rich enough, but beyond that level, I think it accumulates because it has accumulated. In the Arab context, also to the previous question, I wanted to say one more thing, which is censorship has been decisive. The fact that you can go to this other place and say, oh God, I'm talking about medieval Denmark, I'm not talking about contemporary Damascus, contemporary Cairo, and the fact that there is this other place to go that is richly developed, that has details and characters and political dynamics, and that people are likely to know about, so they'll recognize again what you're doing when you play with it, what changes you're making to suit the local case. This has been absolutely decisive to Shakespeare's success in the Arab theater.
No, Inji and then Ethan, I think, and then we had another question.
Thank you. Another reason why we always talk about Shakespeare's, I guess, given the context of adaptations especially, he is an ever-adaptable playwright, and adaptation dates back to Shakespeare himself. He is a great adapter himself, having used cultural material, having used history, having used, all the cultural textuality in his writing. So any discussion, on adaptations would inevitably connect to Shakespeare, I believe. And I do believe, in our class we discuss usually whether, certain adaptations we can consider adaptations or appropriations following Julie Sanders' theory. And I innately believe that any adapter would inevitably follow the pattern of Shakespeare in adapting. Therefore, we will talk about Shakespeare.
Okay, I obviously, as like the early modernist, you would expect me to defend the greatness of Shakespeare or something, which I'm not going to do. I think I agree with Margaret that it is almost entirely a matter of the Shakespeare brand. But I mean, you could say that about any sacred text. What makes a text sacred or a body of text sacred is 90% historical contingency. If you ask somebody in 1680, is Shakespeare going to be the person everyone knows from the early 17th century and everyone would forget Beaumont and Fletcher? Dryden would be like, that's crazy talk, right? How do these things, how do you build a canon around something? These things sort of take on a mind of their own in certain ways. You could say this, you could ask the same questions about the New Testament in a Western context. I'm sure we can think about other sacred literatures in other contexts. How do they become so powerful in our imaginations? It might not be any particular thing necessarily intrinsic to them, although, of course, as other people have said, you can't just do this for any text, right? But I think maybe the other question is why Hamlet in particular? Why does Hamlet, above all these other Shakespeare plays, have this status? And I think one answer is that there's a Shakespeare brand, and then there's a Hamlet brand, right? Which is a whole nother sub-brand within the Shakespeare brand. But I also think it's because of the powerful image of the ghost and how the ghost raises questions of the nature of political authority and the relationship between authority and action that I don't think any other early modern play does effectively. And just to say one more thing about that, I would just add that what's interesting about Hamlet is how it raises that question, not how it answers it necessarily. And so what I would say about some of the Turkish controversies and so forth is that it seems to me that a Hamlet adaptation that is so concerned about the authority of the original and is so loyal to the authority of the original and is so servile to the authority of the original is not really an authentic Hamlet at all. I know it's an inauthentic Hamlet to be so servile, so preoccupied with the original. So I'm a fan of modernized Shakespeare's. So, okay.
We have a question waiting, and then Başak.
He's so cynical. Are you coming tonight? I have to go to the same anxiety. Okay.
This is at which theater you said? I'm sorry. At the Kantar Tiyatrosu. Thank you. Başak, and now the microphone's gone.
I was thinking about, I wonder if there's a difference between the United Channels institutions in India and Shakespeare are successful. Because Margaret mentioned that you stated how these responses to the relationship with Shakespeare is different because it came through an education. Especially for both Turkish and Arabic context. Do you think there is a difference between receiving Shakespeare through education, like mandatory education curriculum, and other entertainment like cinema versus theater? Is there a difference? Because I don't think Shakespeare is part of the middle school, high school tertiary education. If we learn about these by names and by summaries, very much maybe Aklımız translated the text in the formal summaries. Actually, a lot of them. And when you receive these texts to an education system, that could be contributing to that sanctity and of the text, and it's guided by an official interpretation of the text, and that would shut down it to play with it. Is it part of the education system in the Arabic world? there differences between different media like cinema or theater?
Okay, I honestly have limited knowledge about this. I mean, the education policies at the moment. You mean the moment, right now, or? I mean, as far as my study is concerned, I've been talking about this to theater people, asking them like what part of the education Shakespeare was there, and he is a huge part of it. So that is why they have this anxiety as to understanding, then relating, then working through, then questioning, or whether questioning or not. Some does not question, and some goes through this nostalgia of this earlier Republican, very much loyal, very much westernized marker of knowledge idea of Shakespeare. Some question this, but to do so, they have it very strictly in their education, as far as I know.
So would you consider that at the university level, right? So it's not
It's university level. Not Shakespeare. Not necessarily. I don't think so.
How would you evaluate university level education in terms of like closeness and official narrative versus interpretation?
You mean in like a conservatory, as opposed to a regular university curriculum?
That's not doing your research work.
No, I'm just thinking. I'm thinking.
Well, so while you're thinking, let's ask the students here. So how many, and this is a very self-selected group of students that has found their way into this room on this afternoon, how many of you had read a Shakespeare play before arriving at university? So. So in high school? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which play?
Othello. There's one Othello. Hamlet. Macbeth.
In English or in Turkish or?
Turkish.
Hamlet in Turkish. Yeah, most of my students have read usually Romeo and Juliet and maybe one other play. And when I ask them on the first day why they're taking my course, which is an elective course, they come up with this cultural anxiety of, oh, I've always felt I need to know more about Shakespeare. And this gets back to your question, I say, and you've never felt you need to know more about Milton. That's sort of why? Why this writer?
We should also just say, I mean, also Shakespeare comes with a whole editorial apparatus, right, around it that hides how contingent the texts themselves are. As Inji brought up, like, you know, Hamlet exists in multiple versions. What's the real Hamlet? Shakespeare collaborates with had collaborated with other playwrights in the early modern period, and the modern editorial
That's all been cleaned up, yeah.
apparatus just totally suppresses that messiness of what Shakespeare means as a signifier.
I think one reason Hamlet is so adaptable and so receptive to obsessions of different kinds is that it's so incoherent. It's a terrible play. It's two separate plays jammed together. The more active, more religious, bad quarto, and the more sort of literary reflective second quarto. Let's kind of put them all together and keep every word of both, and then puzzle over this puzzling hero who doesn't make sense for 400 to 500 years.
So I was just thinking earlier that, and again, like I said, we don't necessarily have to think about this question, but one very obvious question that's kind of been coming out of the question of why Hamlet? What is it about this play? What is it about the fact that we have a towering political ideal that is past, right? But that comes back in the form of a dream or a ghost or whatever. And the fact that there is what appears to be an unjust political situation at stake in the moment is that the larger kind of self-reflexive question that Hamlet poses is what has been made to pose, let's say, is how does art operate under conditions of dictatorship, right? How does art operate under conditions where it needs to be consciously aware of its own ability to live with, against, in conjunction with, somehow survive amongst, right? excessive political authority. And it seems as though it's not a surprise that that question keeps bringing us back to the particular text of Hamlet in a geography that has had a lengthy historical experience of that political phenomenon, right? I don't mean to suggest such an overdetermination, but it seems...
Well, it's in the text, right? Hamlet is doing this himself. He's trying to produce a politically motivated adaptation of a prestigious foreign play, this excellent Italian thing, The Murder of Gonzago, and he does a terrible job. He botches it up. He misplays all his cards. He kind of reveals his game too early.
And he presumes he has an audience whose political conscience somehow correlates with his own, right? Which may or may not be the correct presumption.
He presumes that the king has a conscience.
Right.
Well, I mean, the play is about someone killing the king, and everyone would be worried about that, you know?
True.
A nephew killing his uncle.
Yeah, it's a poor choice of a script.
Fair enough.
It's a poor choice on Hamlet's part.
Really, yes.
Other questions or other thoughts? Well, thank you all so much for being here with us today. Again, like I said, on this odd and difficult day. And if you have other questions that you would like to talk about that you did not, for whatever reason, want to ask earlier, please feel free to come up and speak with with Margaret and with our respondents. And thank you again so much for being here. Thank you.